In March 2021, the bodies of Drake and Vivian Blackwood were found on the pavement outside Eclipse Industries' Manhattan headquarters. Security footage showed both falling from the 45th floor penthouse in what initially appeared to be a murder-suicide. But the truth behind their deaths would expose a dark web of corporate predation, orchestrated murders, and one woman's devastating journey from grief to fatal obsession. Let's go back to where it all began. In March 2020, as New York City grappled with the first wave of the pandemic, Eclipse Industries stood nearly empty, its gleaming halls echoing with an unfamiliar silence. While most employees had been sent home to work remotely, Drake Blackwood saw opportunity in crisis. At 45, the CEO had built his empire by exploiting moments of chaos, and this pandemic offered perfect cover for his darker inclinations. The morning of March 15, 2020, brought Aria Winters to the near-empty office building. At 27, she was one of the few employees deemed essential to maintain critical operations. Her black mask matched her morning dress. She had lost her husband Kai just 2 months before the world shut down, his accident at a construction site leaving her alone to face an increasingly uncertain world. Drake watched her arrival through the building's security feed, noting how she pulled her mask down briefly to show her ID to security. Even through the grainy footage, he could see the wedding ring still on her finger, the way grief had hollowed her cheeks. He had been watching her since January, noting how the isolation of early widowhood had seamlessly merged with pandemic lockdowns, leaving her more vulnerable than ever. What made Aria particularly interesting to Drake was her dedication to the office. While others fought to work from home, she volunteered to come in, finding solace in empty corridors and the routine of work. Her therapy sessions had moved to Zoom calls, which she took from her office, unknowingly providing Drake with intimate insights into her psychological state. "Sir, Mrs. Winters is here for the 9 o'clock, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. She was the only other person on the executive floor, maintained as a necessary witness to his carefully crafted public persona. Vivian Blackwood monitored the meeting from her home office, accessing the security feeds remotely. At 42, Drake's wife had perfected the art of digital surveillance, using the pandemic as an excuse to install even more sophisticated monitoring systems throughout the building. She watched as Aria entered Drake's office, noting how her husband adjusted his mask, playing the role of the safety-conscious executive. "Please, sit." Drake gestured to a chair positioned exactly 6 feet from his desk. "We can remove our masks since we're properly distanced." His smile, hidden for months in public, was now a calculated tool. "I appreciate your dedication during these unprecedented times." Aria sat carefully, removing her mask to reveal a face still marked by recent grief. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Actually, being in the office helps. Home is too quiet now." The words caught slightly in her throat. Drake leaned forward, maintaining the prescribed distance while creating artificial intimacy. "I understand loss, Mrs. Winters. My first wife passed away during the 2008 financial crisis. Times of global uncertainty make personal tragedies even harder to bear." The lie, like his many others, was tailored to the moment. In her Greenwich mansion, Vivian added another note to her digital files. The fictional first wife story evolved with each telling, adapting to mirror the vulnerabilities of each target. She split her screen between the security feed and news reports of rising COVID cases, wondering if her husband had finally found the perfect conditions for his predatory games. The promotion interview proceeded according to Drake's design. He praised Aria's commitment to coming into the office, noting how her presence helped maintain corporate culture during the crisis. The position of marketing director would require regular in-person meetings. "Some things just can't be done effectively over Zoom," he explained with practiced concern. Throughout that day, news of Aria's promotion spread through virtual channels. Slack messages and emails buzzed with speculation. Some questioned promoting someone so recently widowed during a global crisis. Others praised Drake's compassion in recognizing talent despite challenging circumstances. Each digital reaction was logged and analyzed. That evening, as the city's 8 o'clock applause for healthcare workers echoed through nearly empty streets, Drake stood at his window watching the changed city below. On his monitor, Aria sat alone in her new office, mask pulled down, unconsciously touching her wedding ring as she worked late into the night. Vivian's face appeared on his screen in an unexpected video call. "The virtual charity gala needs our attention," she announced, her eyes sharp even through the digital interface. "And I noticed Aria's working late again." Drake minimized the security feed smoothly. "The pandemic has been hard on everyone, darling. Some find comfort in work." His practiced smile never wavered. "The company takes care of its own." Later that night, in her home office, Vivian updated her evidence files with screenshots from the day's surveillance. The pandemic had made her husband bolder, she noticed. Social distancing protocols and empty offices provided new opportunities for isolation and control. She began a new folder labeled Spring 2020, sensing this case might be different from the others. In her small Upper East Side apartment, Aria sat on her bed, surrounded by reminders of Kai. Her laptop glowed with a cancelled therapy appointment. "The office schedule is getting busy," she had explained. "Things are finally looking up." She ignored the news alerts about rising COVID cases, focusing instead on the promise of purpose the promotion offered. What Aria couldn't know was that while the world was locking down, she was being drawn into a trap more dangerous than any virus. Drake Blackwood had found in the pandemic the perfect conditions for his manipulation. Isolation, fear, and a desperate need for connection all worked in his favor. The lights of Eclipse Industries shone through the darkness of a city in crisis, one of the few buildings still showing signs of life. Inside its walls, the first act of a tragedy was unfolding, masked by the larger drama of a global pandemic. Drake had chosen his moment perfectly. In a world where everyone wore masks, it was harder than ever to recognize the face of a predator. Only Vivian Blackwood, watching through her network of digital eyes, understood what was truly beginning. As New York City entered its darkest spring, 3 lives were about to become entangled in a web of manipulation that would eventually end in violence. But for now, the city's eerie silence masked the approaching storm, and Aria Winters, alone in her grief and isolation, had no way of knowing she had already been chosen as its center. By April 2020, as New York City's sirens wailed day and night, Eclipse Industries had settled into an eerie routine. While most employees connected through pixelated Zoom calls, Drake Blackwood had engineered a small essential team that needed to maintain physical presence in the office. Aria Winters was, of course, central to this group. The week after her promotion, Drake began laying his groundwork carefully. Security footage from April 7th captured their first, accidental, evening encounter. Aria was working late, as she often did now, when Drake appeared at her office door, his mask pulled down to reveal a concerned smile. "You're here late again, Mrs. Winters," he observed, maintaining a careful distance. "Dedication like yours is rare these days." He held up 2 coffee cups from the high-end shop down the street, the only one still open in the area. "I always order 2 out of habit. Would be a shame to waste it." What Aria didn't know was that Drake had been monitoring her coffee orders through the building's security cameras. He knew she favored oat milk lattes with an extra shot, a detail he had filed away for precisely this moment. Her surprise at his accurate guess only reinforced his carefully crafted image of thoughtfulness. From her home command center, Vivian Blackwood watched the interaction with growing unease. She had seen this pattern before: the casual coffee, the late-night conversations that would follow, the gradual erosion of professional boundaries. But something about this time felt different. The isolation of the pandemic added a new layer of danger to Drake's usual methodology. As April progressed, Drake intensified his research into Kai's death. The construction site accident that claimed Aria's husband's life contained irregularities that interested him deeply. Late one night, he reviewed the police reports he'd obtained through his connections. Kai Winters, age 29, fell from the 10th floor of an unfinished building. The safety harness had apparently malfunctioned, a tragic equipment failure that raised questions but led nowhere. Drake's interest in the case didn't go unnoticed. On April 15th, Vivian logged into their home network to find searches about construction site accidents, safety harness manufacturers, and detailed queries about Kai Winters' employer. She added these to her growing file, noting how her husband's pattern was evolving. Usually, he simply exploited existing tragedies. This time, His curiosity suggested something darker. Meanwhile, Aria found herself looking forward to her office days with increasing anticipation. In a city locked down by fear and death, Eclipse Industries became her sanctuary. The empty corridors and quiet offices offered structure when the world seemed to be crumbling. And then there was Drake, whose steady presence and understanding seemed to cut through her isolation. Their coffee breaks became an unspoken routine. Every evening around 7, when the handful of other employees had left, Drake would appear with 2 cups of coffee. They maintained social distance, sitting at opposite ends of the conference room, but their conversations grew increasingly personal. "The nights are the hardest," Aria admitted during one such evening, her voice soft in the empty building. "Everything reminds me of Kai. At least here, I can focus on work instead of memories." Drake nodded sympathetically. "Grief is a strange companion during isolation," he replied, sharing details about his fictional first wife's death. "Sometimes the world forces us to mourn alone. But you're not alone here, Aria." It was the first time he had used her first name. The security footage from that night, carefully archived by Vivian, showed the subtle shift in Aria's posture at the use of her name. A slight lean forward, an unconscious response to the manufactured intimacy. Vivian noted the timestamp, April 22nd, 9:47 p.m. The moment professional boundaries began to blur. By early May, the private coffee meetings had expanded to include working dinners. Drake arranged for exclusive restaurants, officially closed but willing to accommodate the CEO of Eclipse Industries, to deliver elaborate meals to the office. Each dinner was justified by urgent projects, each conversation carefully steered toward personal revelations. Office gossip, though largely confined to virtual channels, began to circulate. The handful of employees still coming to the office noticed the changes in Aria. Her grief seemed to be lifting, replaced by a new energy. She smiled more, stayed later, and spoke of Drake with growing animation during video calls. On May 10th, during a late-night review of marketing strategies, Drake orchestrated their first physical contact. He reached for a document at the same moment as Aria, their hands brushing briefly. Security footage caught his practiced hesitation, the way he pulled back with apparent embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he apologized, maintaining his role as the consummate professional. "We should be more careful about distancing." But the moment had served its purpose, breaking the physical barrier while reinforcing his image of restraint. Vivian, reviewing the footage the next morning, recognized the calculated nature of the interaction. She had seen this move before, but the pandemic added a new dimension. In a world where human contact was forbidden, even the smallest touch carried heightened significance. The true turning point came on May 15th, when Drake asked Aria to join a private video call after hours. From her apartment, surrounded by Kai's photos, Aria connected to find Drake in what appeared to be his home office. The careful professional facade was replaced by casual clothing and a more intimate setting. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he began, his voice carrying just the right note of uncertainty. "But I've been concerned about you working so late. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who understands, someone who's walked a similar path." The conversation lasted 3 hours. Under the guise of mentorship, Drake drew out Aria's deepest fears and vulnerabilities. He learned about her nightmares, her financial worries, her guilt over feeling anything positive in a world filled with death. Each revelation was carefully filed away for future use. Vivian, who had accessed the call through her surveillance network, watched her husband's performance with growing alarm. His usual pattern was accelerating, adapted to exploit the unique circumstances of the pandemic. The isolation, the constant proximity of death, the human need for connection, all played into his hands. By the end of May, Aria's transformation was noticeable even through video calls. She had started styling her hair again, wearing color instead of black. During their now nightly coffee meetings, she sat closer to Drake, the 6-foot distance gradually shrinking. Her wedding ring, though still present, had moved to her right hand, a change Drake noted with satisfaction. What no one else knew was that Drake had begun visiting the construction site where Kai died. Late at night, after leaving the office, he would stand in the shadows of the now completed building, piecing together the events of that fatal day. His interest went beyond mere research. He was looking for something specific, something that would give him ultimate power over Aria's emotional state. The city's continued lockdown provided perfect cover for his machinations. In a world where masks hid expressions and fear kept people apart, Drake's careful grooming of Aria went largely unnoticed. Only Vivian, watching through her network of cameras and monitoring software, recognized the familiar pattern evolving into something more sinister. As May drew to a close, Drake's plan entered its next phase. He began leaving files about Kai's accident visible during their video calls, waiting for Aria to notice. The trap was set, baited with the promise of answers about her husband's death. In a city still echoing with sirens, where death had become a daily companion, Drake knew the lure of truth would be irresistible. The stage was set for a deeper manipulation, one that would blur the lines between grief and desire, between professional concern and personal obsession. As New York City struggled through its darkest spring, Aria Winters was being drawn into a web from which there would be no easy escape. By June 2020, as New York City cautiously emerged from lockdown, Drake Blackwood had identified every blind spot in Eclipse Industries' surveillance system. Years of careful study had revealed the 6-minute loop in the parking garage cameras, the empty floor under renovation on level 38, and most importantly, the service elevator that didn't appear on his wife's monitoring network. On June 15th, Drake orchestrated their first real moment of intimacy. He had asked Aria to review marketing materials in the level 38 conference room, a space he knew was currently invisible to Vivian's cameras due to renovation interference. The empty floor echoed with their footsteps as they walked through dimly lit corridors. "The isolation is getting to me," Aria admitted, setting down her laptop. Her wedding ring now hung on a chain around her neck, not gone, but no longer a barrier. "Sometimes I feel guilty for still being alive when so many aren't." Drake moved closer, maintaining the appearance of professional distance while steadily closing the emotional gap. "Survivor's guilt," he said softly. "I know it well." His hand brushed hers as he reached for the marketing documents, a touch that lingered just long enough to seem unintentional. In her Greenwich mansion, Vivian frowned at the empty security feeds from level 38. Construction interference had been increasing lately, creating blind spots in her surveillance network. She noted the pattern but couldn't prove intent. Drake had always been meticulous about maintaining plausible deniability. The affair began officially on a rainy evening in late June. Drake had arranged for a crucial client meeting at a boutique hotel that had recently reopened. The hotel's security system, like many during the pandemic, was operating at minimum capacity. In a corner suite, away from cameras and curious eyes, professional boundaries finally dissolved completely. Aria's guilt manifested immediately afterward. "This is wrong," she whispered, clutching the necklace that held her wedding ring. "Kai!" Drake had prepared for this moment. "Life is for the living, Aria. The world is different now. We've all seen how quickly everything can change." His words, practiced but delivered with seeming sincerity, offered absolution she desperately craved. Their meetings became more frequent but carefully orchestrated. Drake selected locations based on surveillance blind spots, the closed floor of an affiliated office building, a supposedly empty conference center, hidden corners of the parking garage during camera loops. Each location was chosen not just for privacy, but to avoid Vivian's increasingly sophisticated monitoring. July brought a heat wave and rising tensions. During video meetings, Aria struggled to maintain professional composure. Her camera angles were always slightly off, her attention seemingly scattered. Office gossip, though still largely confined to Zoom chats and Slack channels, began to take note of her transformation. "Have you seen Aria lately?" one colleague messaged another. "She's different. Happier maybe." "Moving on too fast," came the reply. "Poor Kai's only been gone 6 months." Drake's possessiveness emerged gradually but intensely. When Aria mentioned a dinner with old friends, his reaction was subtle but clear. "With everything going on, it's safer to stick to our bubble," he advised, making it sound like health concern rather than control. By August, Aria had moved her wedding ring from the necklace to her jewelry box. Drake watched her make this decision during one of their hotel meetings, satisfaction hidden behind practiced concern. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked, playing his role perfectly. "The past is the past," she replied, unaware of the irony in her words. "You've helped me see that life goes on." Vivian noticed the missing ring during a video conference. She added it to her evidence file, along with timestamps of Aria and Drake's simultaneous absences from surveillance feeds. The pattern was clear, but proving anything was becoming increasingly difficult. Her husband had learned from past mistakes. Drake's control tightened imperceptibly. He began suggesting which projects Aria should take on, which employees she should trust, how late she should work. Each suggestion was framed as protection, mentorship, care. "I just want what's best for you," became his mantra. In her apartment, now filled with gifts Drake had carefully selected, Aria missed the warning signs. Each present seemed thoughtful, a rare book mentioned in passing, a sculpture that matched her taste. She didn't notice how these objects were slowly replacing her memories of Kai. The affair's escalation coincided with increasing gaps in Vivian's surveillance network. Technical glitches became more frequent, security cameras underwent mysterious maintenance, and Drake's schedule grew increasingly opaque. She could track the broad strokes of his movements but kept losing crucial details. September brought cooler weather and bolder moves. Drake began taking more risks, confident in his ability to avoid detection. A quick kiss in his office between meetings, a lingering touch in the elevator, small moments that fed Aria's growing addiction to their secret relationship. What Aria couldn't see were the others. Women who watched her transformation with knowing eyes. Janet from accounting, who had suddenly transferred 2 years ago. Michelle from legal, who had abruptly moved to London. They recognized the signs but kept their silence, their own scars still too fresh to risk exposure. Drake's true nature emerged in subtle ways. His texts became more frequent, his questions about her whereabouts more specific. "Just checking you're safe," he would say, making control sound like care. These are dangerous times. By mid-September, Aria was completely ensnared. She had withdrawn from old friends, citing pandemic concerns. Her therapy sessions, once focused on grieving Kai, now centered on vague discussions of moving forward. Her world had narrowed to Drake and work, exactly as he had planned. In her study, Vivian compiled her evidence methodically. Credit card statements showing hotel charges, timestamps of missing surveillance footage, patterns of behavior she recognized from previous cases. But Drake had learned each piece of evidence could be explained away, each suspicious moment justified by business necessity. What no one yet realized was that this affair would be different. Drake's usual pattern of seduction and abandonment was shifting into something more dangerous. His obsession with Kai's death hadn't waned. If anything, it had intensified. Late at night, in moments even Aria didn't know about, he still visited the construction site where Kai had died, piecing together a puzzle whose solution would change everything. As autumn approached, the stage was set for tragedy. Aria, caught in a web of passion and manipulation, had no way of knowing she was simply the latest player in Drake's elaborate game. But this time, the game had new rules, and even Drake couldn't predict its deadly conclusion. October 2020 painted New York in autumn colors, but Aria Winters only had eyes for the luxury hotel suite where she now spent her weekends. The Four Seasons downtown had become their sanctuary, carefully chosen by Drake for its discreet service entrance and compromised security system. Here, on the 42nd floor, the world beyond their passionate encounters ceased to exist. "I've never felt this way before," Aria whispered one Sunday morning, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across Drake's shoulder. The guilt that had once plagued her had transformed into a different kind of ache. Desperate love tinged with fear of losing him. "Sometimes it feels too good to be true." Drake traced her spine with practiced tenderness, his touch masking the calculation behind each caress. "You deserve happiness, Aria. After everything you've been through." He let the words hang, knowing she would fill the silence with her own emotions. "I'd give up everything for you." These weekend escapes had become their ritual. Drake had convinced Vivian that his new wellness routine included Saturday morning golf at an exclusive club, a habit that explained his regular absences. Instead, he spent those hours tangled in silk sheets with Aria, crafting promises of a future together. Meanwhile, Vivian's investigation had uncovered a pattern spanning years. In her private study, she compiled a timeline. Janet Cooper, 2015, widow, resigned after 6 months. Michelle Chen, 2017, recently divorced, transferred to London. Sarah Mitchell, 2019, domestic abuse survivor, current whereabouts unknown. Each woman had been vulnerable, each had fallen under Drake's spell, and each had vanished from the company under mysterious circumstances. But Drake had evolved. His usual corporate email account now showed perfect professional boundaries with Aria. Instead, they communicated through an encrypted messaging app, leaving no digital trail. Their meetings appeared as innocent work sessions in both their calendars, while the reality played out in luxury hotels and hidden apartments. Aria's love for Drake had become all-consuming. She redecorated her apartment, removing the last photos of Kai. Her wedding ring, once worn around her neck, now lay forgotten in a drawer. She bought new clothes, changed her hair, transformed herself into the woman she thought Drake wanted. "You've brought me back to life," she told him, meaning every word. What she didn't see were the red flags. The way Drake checked her phone when she wasn't looking. How he questioned her about every male colleague. His subtle suggestions about which friends she should keep in touch with. Each controlling move was wrapped in concern. "I just worry about you," or "the world's not safe right now." The first warning came in late October. An anonymous email from a ProtonMail account. "He's not who you think he is. Ask about Janet Cooper." Aria deleted it without a second thought, her trust in Drake absolute. When she mentioned it casually over dinner, his reaction was perfectly calibrated. "Ah, poor Janet," he sighed, taking Aria's hand across the table. "She had a breakdown after her husband died. Became obsessed with me because I tried to help her. I blamed myself for not seeing the signs sooner." The lie slipped out smoothly, reinforcing his image as a compassionate mentor while discrediting any future warnings. November brought darker nights and deeper entanglement. Drake began suggesting Aria move to an apartment closer to his area, "so I can see you more easily." He introduced her to his private banker, encouraging her to let him take care of her financial future. Each move increased his control while appearing as generous care. During one particularly passionate weekend, Drake revealed what seemed like his deepest vulnerability. "My marriage to Vivian was a business arrangement," he confessed, timing the revelation perfectly. "We haven't shared a real connection in years. But with you," he let his voice break slightly. "With you, I feel alive again." Aria absorbed every word, every touch, every promise. She began dreaming of their future together, a future Drake painted in vivid detail. They would travel once the pandemic ended, live in his penthouse in Paris, start fresh where no one knew them. Her love transformed these manipulative fantasies into concrete plans. But the darkness around them was closing in. A second anonymous email arrived. "He watched your husband die." This one shook her more deeply, but Drake was prepared. He held her as she cried, turned her fear into greater dependence on him, used the warning to bind her closer. "Someone's trying to hurt us," he murmured into her hair. "We have to be more careful now. Trust no one but me." His possessiveness, now given justification, tightened like a noose. In early December, a former employee tried to reach Aria through LinkedIn. Before she could respond, Drake orchestrated a company-wide cybersecurity alert about phishing attempts, making any such contact seem suspicious. He was closing ranks, isolating her from potential warnings while making it seem like protection. Vivian, watching through her dwindling surveillance network, noticed how Aria had changed. The young widow's transformation went beyond normal grieving. Her movements had become furtive, her online presence carefully curated. During video calls, Aria's eyes constantly darted off-screen, presumably to messages from Drake. The affair had entered its most dangerous phase. Drake's masks began slipping, showing glimpses of his true nature. He raged when Aria was 10 minutes late meeting him, then showered her with apologies and gifts. He installed a tracking app on her phone for her safety and demanded she keep her camera on during all calls when they weren't together. Aria interpreted these red flags as signs of passionate love. Each possessive gesture proved his devotion, Each controlling demand showed his care. She had fallen so deeply into his web that she could no longer distinguish between love and manipulation. What no one knew was that Drake's endgame was approaching. His obsession with Kai's death hadn't been random. He had orchestrated that accident months before making his move on Aria. Now, as winter descended on the city, he was preparing to claim his prize completely. In her mansion, Vivian compiled her evidence with growing urgency. She had seen this pattern before, but never so elaborate, never so complete. Drake wasn't just seducing Aria. He was reshaping her entire reality. And somewhere in the background, the truth about Kai's death waited to shatter everything. December's early darkness found Aria in Drake's arms, more in love and more trapped than ever. "I'd die without you," she whispered, not realizing these words delighted him. In the web of lies and passion he had woven, she had become exactly what he wanted, completely, devastatingly dependent on him. The stage was set for the final act of Drake's manipulation. As Christmas lights began appearing across the city, no one could predict how this deadly game would end. Aria, lost in what she thought was the greatest love of her life, had no way of knowing she was actually living out Drake's most elaborate and dangerous obsession yet. January 2021 arrived with a snowstorm that blanketed New York in deceptive peace. For Aria Winters, the new year brought morning sickness she could no longer ignore. Standing in her bathroom on January 3rd, staring at the third positive pregnancy test, she felt her carefully constructed world begin to crack. The confrontation with Vivian came unexpectedly the next day. Aria was leaving her doctor's appointment when a black Tesla pulled alongside her. "We need to talk," Vivian said through the lowered window. "About the women who came before you." The upscale coffee shop Vivian chose was empty except for them. Social distancing gave them privacy as Vivian laid out her evidence. Photographs, emails, police reports. Janet Cooper didn't have a breakdown, Vivian explained quietly. She disappeared after threatening to expose Drake. Michelle Chen didn't choose to transfer. She fled after he became violent. Aria's hands shook as she looked at the photos. Janet's bruised face. Michelle's police report. Sarah Mitchell's last known surveillance footage entering Drake's private elevator. Her protective illusions began crumbling. "He's not just unfaithful," Vivian continued, sliding forward a USB drive. "He's dangerous. And now that you're pregnant, you're in more danger than ever." Aria's head snapped up. "How did you?" "I've been watching him destroy women for years," Vivian replied. "I know the signs. And I know what he does when they become inconvenient." That same evening, Drake's mask slipped for the first time. When Aria mentioned feeling unwell, trying to gauge his reaction to her pregnancy, his concern carried an edge of panic. "You've seen a doctor?" he demanded, grip tightening on her arm. When? Who knows about this?" His fingers left bruises she would later hide under long sleeves. But it was his eyes that truly frightened her. Cold, calculating. Nothing like the loving gaze she thought she knew. The next week brought revelations in rapid succession. A former security guard, emboldened by the corporate board's quiet investigation, came forward with footage of Drake's violent outburst against Michelle Chen. An anonymous email provided proof of hush money paid to Janet Cooper's family. Each piece of evidence shattered Aria's image of the man she loved. Drake's behavior became increasingly erratic. He appeared at her apartment unannounced, claiming he was worried about her. His gifts became excessive, suffocating. When she didn't answer his calls immediately, his messages switched from concern to threats and back to love in dizzying succession. "You're mine," he whispered during what would be their last intimate encounter. "No one else can have you." The possessiveness that had once seemed romantic now felt like a noose. On January 15th, Aria tried to create distance. She cited COVID concerns to work from home, but Drake's response was immediate and frightening. He showed up at her apartment that night, rage barely contained. "You don't make decisions without consulting me," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "We're in this together. Forever." His hand rested on her stomach, the gesture no longer loving but threatening. Vivian's alliance proved crucial. She had prepared for this moment, setting up a secure apartment and creating a paper trail of corporate misconduct. The board is ready to act, she told Aria during a clandestine meeting. But we need you to testify. The corporate investigation gained momentum when Sarah Mitchell's body was found in a construction site. The same company that had worked on the building where Kai died. The connection was impossible to ignore. Drake's control over Eclipse Industries began slipping. Board members, armed with Vivian's evidence, started questioning his decisions. Long-silent employees found their voices, sharing stories of his manipulation and abuse. Aria's pregnancy became impossible to hide by late January. The office support system that had been quietly forming around her sprang into action. Security guards began escorting her to her car. Female colleagues created a buddy system for bathroom breaks. IT staff swept her devices for tracking software. But Drake was always one step ahead. He had copies of her keys, access to her building's security system, and most terrifyingly, proof of her complicity in corporate fraud. Documents he had manipulated her into signing during their affair. Think carefully about your next move, he warned during their last office encounter. Remember, you're carrying my child. You'll never be free of me. The final straw came when Aria discovered the truth about Kai's death. Hidden in Drake's private server, accessed through Vivian's corporate backdoor, were emails proving he had orchestrated the construction site accident. He had been watching her for months before Kai's death, planning every detail of her eventual seduction. The realization broke something in Aria. The man she had loved was a carefully constructed fiction. The passionate affair that had given her life meaning was built on her husband's murder. As January drew to a close, 3 lives teetered on the edge of destruction. Aria, carrying Drake's child and evidence of his crimes. Vivian, ready to destroy everything to stop her husband's reign of terror. And Drake, his masks crumbling, revealing the monster beneath. The snow continued falling over New York, covering the city in false peace. But within the walls of Eclipse Industries, a storm was building. Drake's carefully constructed world was about to shatter, and he would take everyone down with him if he could. In her new secure apartment, Aria placed her hand over her growing child, feeling the weight of impossible choices. The love she had felt was dying, replaced by fear and determination. She had survived Kai's death. She would survive this too. But first, she would have to face the darkest truth of all. The man she had given her heart to was the same one who had orchestrated her husband's murder. February brought bitter cold and the complete unraveling of Drake Blackwood's carefully constructed world. The first domino fell on February 3rd when Sarah Mitchell's autopsy report leaked to the board. The cause of death, strangulation followed by a staged overdose, matched bruising patterns from Michelle Chen's previous police report. Drake's response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Aria's corporate email was flooded with evidence of financial misconduct. Documents she had unknowingly signed during their affair. Her name appeared on offshore accounts, questionable contracts, and fraudulent reports. Your career is over, Drake's voice was iced through the phone. But we can fix this together. Come home to me, Aria. Think of our child. That same night, Vivian Blackwood disappeared. Her Tesla was found abandoned in the Greenwich Mansion's garage, her phone and laptop missing. The security cameras had been disabled an hour before her disappearance, a familiar pattern that sent chills through the investigative team. In her secure apartment, now 12 weeks pregnant, Aria watched the news of Vivian's disappearance with growing horror. The pregnancy she had once dreamed would bind her to Drake now felt like a tether to a monster. Each kick reminded her not of love, but of danger. The police investigation officially began when they found Vivian's phone, smashed but recoverable, in a dumpster behind Eclipse Industries. Detective Sandra Martinez, assigned to the case, quickly connected it to Sarah Mitchell's death and the outstanding questions about Janet Cooper's disappearance. Mrs. Winters, Detective Martinez said during their first meeting, "We believe Mr. Blackwood may be responsible for multiple deaths, including your husband's. We need your help to prove it." But Drake was already moving to silence Aria. On February 10th, she arrived at work to find her security clearance revoked, her office locked, and HR processing her termination. As security escorted her out, Drake watched from his penthouse office, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. Aria's escape attempt came that night. With help from Detective Martinez, She packed essentials and prepared to enter witness protection. But Drake had anticipated this move. As she approached her car in the underground garage, he stepped out of the shadows. "Did you think I wouldn't know?" His voice echoed off concrete walls. "That I wouldn't protect what's mine?" The gun in his hand gleamed under fluorescent lights. What Drake hadn't anticipated was Aria's own preparation. The garage surveillance, normally on a 6-minute loop, was now streaming live to Detective Martinez. Every word, every threat, was being recorded. "You killed Kai," Aria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You murdered my husband to get to me." Drake's laugh was hollow. "Kai was an obstacle. Just like Vivian became an obstacle. Just like you're becoming an obstacle." He stepped closer, gun unwavering. "But this child is my legacy." The confrontation was interrupted by police sirens, their wail growing closer. Drake's face contorted with rage. Grabbing Aria's arm, he dragged her toward the service elevator, his familiar escape route. What followed was 3 hours of terror. Drake barricaded them in his penthouse office, holding both Aria and the evening cleaning staff hostage. Outside, police negotiators tried to talk him down while tactical teams positioned themselves on adjacent buildings. Inside, Drake's masks fell away completely. He raged about betrayal, about ownership, about his perfect plan destroyed. "Everything I did was for us," he shouted, waving the gun between hostages. "I chose you. I freed you from Kai. I gave you a future." Aria, protecting her unborn child, watched the man she had loved transform into a stranger. The charm that had seduced her was gone, replaced by something feral and desperate. When he turned to her, eyes wild, she finally saw him clearly. "Tell them you love me," he demanded, pressing the gun to her temple. "Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." Instead, Aria revealed her own secret. The recording device Detective Martinez had given her was still transmitting. Every confession, every threat, was being logged as evidence. Drake's reaction was explosive. His grip on her throat was brutal, but before he could pull the trigger, the windows exploded. Tactical teams burst in from multiple entrances. In the chaos, Drake's final act was to reach for Aria's stomach, as if to claim his child one last time. The shot that took him down came from a female SWAT member. Non-fatal, but effective. As Drake was led away in handcuffs, screaming about his rights and his child, police found something else. Vivian's laptop hidden in his office safe. The files it contained exposed everything. Years of stalking potential victims, orchestrating accidents, and manipulating evidence. Emails proving he had sabotaged Kai's safety equipment. Recordings of his conversations with contractors about Sarah Mitchell's murder. A complete record of his predatory pattern. Most chillingly, they found detailed plans for Aria's accident, scheduled for her 3rd trimester. Drake had never intended to let her keep their child. Like everything else, the pregnancy was just another tool for control. In the aftermath, as police processed the crime scene, Detective Martinez wrapped a shock blanket around Aria's shoulders. "Vivian's alive," she revealed quietly. "In protective custody." She knew he'd come after her eventually. Aria placed her hand over her unborn child, feeling the flutter of movement. The nightmare was ending, but its effects would linger. Drake had taken so much, her husband, her trust, nearly her life. But he hadn't taken her strength. As February drew to a close, 3 lives emerged forever changed. Aria, carrying both a child and the scars of survival. Vivian, finally free from years of silent witness. And Drake, his true nature exposed, facing multiple life sentences. The night Drake was arrested, snow fell again over New York City. In her hospital room, under police protection, Aria watched the flakes swirl past her window. Her hand rested on her growing belly, feeling the life within, not Drake's legacy of violence, but her own future of survival and strength. March arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself was building toward the explosive climax that would shake Eclipse Industries to its foundation. On March 15th, exactly 1 year after Aria first walked into Drake's office, everything came to a devastating end. The final confrontation began at sunset. Drake, released on bail through his extensive connections, had barricaded himself in his penthouse office. The corporate board was meeting to vote on his removal, and he had one last card to play, a hidden server containing evidence that could destroy everyone involved. Aria, now visibly pregnant at 5 months, hadn't planned to be there. But when Vivian's message came through, his destroying everything. Come now. She knew she had to face him one last time. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending to her own execution. She found Drake standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out before him like a kingdom he was about to lose. "You've ruined everything," he said without turning. "Our perfect life, our future, our legacy." "There was never our anything," Aria replied, one hand protectively over her belly. "It was all your manipulation. Your lies. Your murders." When Drake turned, the mask was completely gone. In its place was something ancient and terrible, pure, unrestrained rage. "I made you," he roared, advancing toward her. "I chose you. I freed you from that pathetic marriage. I gave you purpose." The revelation about Kai came in a burst of vicious pride. "You should have seen his face when the harness broke," Drake sneered. "That moment of realization before he fell. He died knowing he wasn't enough for you." Aria's grief and rage rose like a tide, but before she could respond, the office door burst open. Vivian stood there, gun raised, flanked by Detective Martinez and a SWAT team. "It's over, Drake," she announced. "The board has the evidence. Everyone knows what you are." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Drake's laugh was hollow as he pressed a button on his desk, activating steel shutters over the doors and windows. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking my legacy with me." He lunged for Aria, his target not her, but the child she carried. The ensuing struggle was chaos. Vivian fired, but Drake was already moving. He grabbed Aria, dragging her toward the private terrace where his helicopter waited. His strength, fueled by desperation, was terrifying. "You think I didn't plan for this?" he shouted over the whir of helicopter blades. "My child will never be raised by anyone else." The SWAT team was cutting through the shutters, but too slowly. On the terrace, Drake forced Aria closer to the edge. 40 stories below, New York traffic moved like tiny toys. Wind whipped around them as Drake's madness reached its peak. "If I can't have you, no one will," he growled, pushing her toward the precipice. "My child dies with you." Vivian's intervention came at the crucial moment. She had accessed the terrace through a maintenance door, approaching silently behind them. As Drake pushed Aria toward the edge, Vivian tackled him. The force of her impact saved Aria, pushing her back onto safer ground. But the momentum carried both Drake and Vivian toward the edge. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where time seemed to stop. Drake, realizing his fate, grabbed Vivian's arm. Her final act was to meet Aria's eyes with a look of fierce triumph before they both went over. The fall seemed to last forever and no time at all. Below, traffic screeched to a halt as 2 bodies impacted the pavement. Drake Blackwood and Vivian Blackwood, husband and wife, predator and protector, died instantly. The aftermath unfolded like a dark tide. Media coverage was explosive, with headlines screaming about murder-suicide at Eclipse Industries. The truth about Drake's crimes emerged in a flood, not just Kai's murder and the other disappearances, but years of corporate fraud, manipulation, and violence. More victims came forward in the weeks that followed. Women who had escaped Drake's orbit shared similar stories of seduction, manipulation, and narrow escapes. The patterns stretched back decades, each story adding to the portrait of a sophisticated predator. The corporate world reeled from the revelations. Eclipse Industries board, desperate to salvage their reputation, offered Aria a settlement that made her unborn child heir to a fortune. The irony was bitter. Drake's obsession with legacy had indeed created one, but not as he intended. April brought spring and with it, renewal. Aria, approaching her 3rd trimester, channeled her trauma into purpose. The Aria Winters Foundation for Survivor Support was established with part of her settlement, offering help to victims of workplace predators and domestic violence. The Foundation's first initiative was a complete overhaul of corporate culture at Eclipse Industries. Surveillance systems were reformed, reporting procedures strengthened, and support systems established. Aria made sure Vivian's sacrifice would create lasting change. In May, as her due date approached, Aria visited 3 graves. At Kai's, she placed white roses and whispered apologies for the months she had spent loving his killer. At Vivian's, she left purple lilies and a promise to continue her work protecting others. At Drake's unmarked grave, she left nothing but her wedding ring, a final rejection of the false love that had nearly destroyed her. On a warm June evening, Aria gave birth to a daughter. She named her Vivian K. Winters, honoring both the woman who saved her life and the husband she had lost. The child would inherit Drake's fortune but not his name, a final defiance against his obsession with legacy. The story of Eclipse Industries became a cautionary tale in corporate America. Books were written, documentaries filmed, policies changed. But for Aria, running the Foundation from her corner office in the renamed Phoenix Tower, the most important change was in herself. She had survived love twisted into obsession, manipulation disguised as devotion, and violence masked as passion. Her daughter would grow up knowing the truth about both her father's monstrosity and her namesake's courage. And somewhere in the city's endless flow, the ghosts of the past, Kai, Vivian, and Drake, faded into memory, leaving Aria to write her own future on her own terms.